Hello, everyone, and welcome to Kembali 2020, Rebuild Bali Festival. It's a digital program that's designed to inspire, to excite, to reconnect, and to revitalise the Balinese and Indonesian communities. And it's running from the 29th of October to the 8th of November 2020. Kembali is the Indonesian word for return or come back, and it represents revitalisation in this time of great global challenges. At a time when travel is pretty much impossible, it's hoped that this year's festival will unite people in Bali, Indonesia, with people all around the world. And creating connections is as important as it's ever been. And so on that note, I'd like to say hello to everybody, to all the familiar faces that I see sitting in the crowd every year, and to those of you who have never been able to make it to Ubud in person. And I'd also like to welcome the writer and broadcaster Richard Fidler to this session about his wonderful new book, The Golden Maze, a biography of Prague. Welcome, Richard.
Hello, Kirsty. Lovely to be here and lovely to be talking with you.
Thank you. For those who don't know, I'm Kirsty Melville, and I'm a documentary producer and the presenter of The History Lesson on ABC Radio National, which is where you also hear Richard's voice on the iconic Conversations program. And Richard, I never thought that I'd miss the sweat dripping down my back as we sit there in Ubud with the roosters crowing in the background, but I do.
I do too. I miss it enormously. I have to admit, last year, 2019 was the first time I've been to Bali, the first time I've been to Ubud. And I had such a wonderful time. My wife and I came and we were just completely overwhelmed, as people often are. I know that's a cliche, but what do you do when that wonderful thing happens, when you come to a place like Bali and it's a place you approach with all these high expectations, and then they get completely exceeded. It's so thrilling and exciting to be there, particularly culturally. I absolutely love the way that art and music and culture are a part of everyday routine of life in Bali. It feels like an idea that's sort of been lost. The way that temples are maintained, the way that the morning ritual goes with temples, the way that there's huge teams of people devoted to arts and crafts in their daily life and to making things beautiful is it's quite thrilling and overwhelming to be in, and it makes you think for quite a long while after you've been there. So yeah, I'm missing it really badly, and this is I suppose a way of I suppose being part of it and thinking about Bali and expressing our longing to go back, Kirsty.
Indeed, and missing the people of Bali and Ubud terribly. Wish we were there with you all. We're thinking of you. So, Richard, about 18 months ago or so, you disappeared off the airwaves of the ABC and took yourself off to Prague for a few months, very quietly. You didn't tell us what you were all doing. But I have this kind of picture of you holed up in this wonderful little apartment in old Prague, researching and writing this book. Is that how it was?
Half right. Yes, I was holed up in an apartment. Yes, I was researching and writing the book. Yes, I was having a completely wonderful time, but it wasn't one of those gorgeous Baroque apartments in the middle of the Prague's Old Town or Mala Strana district. It was actually in a Stalinist apartment block that was built in the 1950s, I think, or 60s, thereabouts, on the outskirts of Prague, near the old movie studios, the Barandov movie studios. One of those kind of things that I suppose the only thing in Australia that you compare it to is the housing commission flats that are in cities like Sydney and Melbourne. They're not very beautiful. They're very tall, socially a little bit alienating, but nonetheless, the flat was really comfortable. It had been the home of a well-known writer, and I'm grateful to his ghost for letting me stay there for 2 months and write the book, because the place was lovely and it was only 20 minutes away from the center of Prague, the atmospheric center of a city that I think is actually the world's most beautiful city.
Why?
There's something weird about it. So there's always this feeling, this prickling sense of expectation that I get whenever I'm there, and many people have had it as well. It's something that's been remarked upon many times. There's something about its shape, the fact that nothing seems to be at right angles. Nothing seems to be terribly planned. The streets curve and bend very pleasingly and seem to gather you up and propel you forward. There's the castle on Hradčany Hill, Europe's biggest castle. I think it's actually the biggest castle in the presidential castle in the world, on the top of the hill there, and the winding streets below. The sense of tension that comes from that, maybe even a sense of trepidation or even menace. You know, there are some cities in the world where you feel like you're close to heaven. I think Paris can be like that. Parts of Istanbul can be like that. Prague, you feel close to something otherworldly, but it's not heaven. And it's not hell either. I don't know what it is, but it's a very odd place. There was a British writer called Patrick Leigh Fermor who was walking across Europe in the 1930s, and he came to Prague. And he talked about the mystery and wonder of Prague. And he said there were moments when every detail seemed to contain the tip of a phalanx of inexplicable phantoms, he said. The great surrealist poet André Breton came to Prague around about the same time with Paul Eluard, and they were struck by the city's great surrealist masterpiece, which is the city itself, which appeared to him to be like a kind of automatic writing, surreal automatic writing, the way you can go from place to place. Prague is a city of symbols as well. There's a street, Neradova Street, that goes up to the castle, whereby above the lintel of every house, there's an odd symbol like two suns, or a swan, or a crayfish, or a horse. And that might refer to the owner's name, from centuries ago, or their occupation. And this is really powerful stuff when you walk through a city like that. I had this sense when I first went there, and I know this sounds really kind of narcissistic, but I had this great powerful sense of déjà vu or homecoming. And rather than think that that was just to some weird hippie notion of some previous life or some nonsense like that, it's not like that at all. It took me a while to put my finger on it. Kirsty, I realized Prague is the landscape of all those fairy tales and European folk tales that are given to many of us as children, but the darker versions of those tales, the one where Cinderella is devoured by the wolf after she dances naked for him. And, you know, there's no friendly woodsman to come and cut her out at the end. The Cinderella, where the ugly sisters of Cinderella lop off portions of their feet to fit their foot into the glass slipper to attract the handsome prince. So Prague is that place. And so you have this delicious and slightly thrilling sense of being in a city that's the landscape, your imaginative landscape of your childhood that you walked away from a long while ago.
How did you spend your days when you were there? Were you writing or were you mostly researching?
Writing in the morning, walking a lot in the afternoon, drinking a lot in the evening, Kirsty, which is entirely appropriate. It's what one is supposed to do. I've got some wonderful friends there now, and I spent time with them. I went out to see bands, so folk music, saw a screening of an extraordinary film. So I did lots of stuff. In the middle of winter, I love going in winter to Prague. It's snowing, there are fewer tourists, and you can walk all day, I find. When I've been there in summer, I tend to walk for about a couple of minutes. I go, oh, sun's over the yard. I'll just duck into a nice, cool beer cellar and have a beer instead, because the beer is so very good and so very cheap. So yes, I spent my mornings writing and then the rest of the day walking around and then going out in the evening. It was great.
So why Prague? Why did you want to tell its story?
It comes out of my first visit to the city. I went there in the aftermath of the city's Velvet Revolution. You remember that year, 1989, in Europe, when they call it Europe's Year of Miracles, where one by one, the communist police states that had been set up by Stalin, these puppet states, collapsed under the weight of popular revolutions. I was living in London at the time. I was performing with a filthy comedy group called the Doug Anthony All-Stars, and we were doing a theatre season. And as we were there, I was watching these revolutions unfold on TV, on the BBC, and it was thrilling. And I was just really longing to be there. Like history was happening, and I wanted to see it. I wanted to be just to be a witness to it all. And I was also happy too. And when the Berlin Wall came down, and I was watching footage of people standing on top of the Berlin Wall and dancing and cheering and throwing champagne around. I was like, oh God, here I am in this dingy flat in London. I was longing to be there. So as soon as I could, when my girlfriend arrived in London, we went to Berlin and then we went to Prague. And Prague, we had no inkling of how to book a hotel room. I spoke absolutely no Czech. I had about 20 phrases of tourist German, and that was about it. And so we had to make our way into the city that was going through this joyous upheaval, this kind of absolutely happy, non-violent, revolutionary madness, where I was suddenly amongst the most happy people in Europe. So this was dazzling. It was thrilling. You know, there's that line of Wordsworth's, William Wordsworth, the English poet, who wrote about the French Revolution. He said, bliss it was on that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. And when he wrote that, he was expecting he knew that the Jacobin terror had happened and he'd become disillusioned. But in Prague, in the Velvet Revolution, we knew there weren't going to be guillotines. We knew there wasn't going to be blood and horror. It was peaceful. It was completely unalloyed joy. And then, so you map that onto this idea that they've overthrown this police state. The new president is this fabulous hippie playwright named Vaclav Havel, a man of unimpeachable moral integrity, a completely decent man, a smoker, a drinker, and who had written internationally renowned plays. He's now the guy in Prague Castle running the joint. And then you map that on top of the fabled, but grimy at the time, loveliness of the city. It was unforgettable. I've waited 3 decades to write this book. It's taken me 3 decades to get it right in my head, I think, Kirsty.
So has it been a little like a virus sitting dormant in your body,
Yes.
just waiting to emerge?
Even creepier, more like a parasite, just chewing through my internal organs and gotten up into my head.
Did you also have a sense that it's a story that hadn't been told?
Yes, particularly in the English-speaking world. I think the Czech people particularly are sort of held at a distance from the English-speaking world. I don't think the English-speaking world knows quite what to make of them or ever has. Milan Kundera, the great Czech writer who wrote The Unbearable Lightness of Being and The Book of Laughter and Forgetting, said that the English-speaking world has been held at a distance from Prague by its people's, what he called a strange and scarcely accessible language. And it is a hard language to navigate if you don't have a Slavic language background. So there is that. When after the First World War, when Prague became the capital of this thriving, free democracy, which had observed human rights, had feminist leaders in the Senate, had a feminist president in Thomas Garrig Masaryk. They had this thriving golden democracy, this kind of this beautiful, happy and free society. They imagined that Britain and France would be their natural compatriots. They go, well, we're part of the club of democracies. But of course, Britain and France let them down so badly when Hitler was determined to tear off parts of it for himself. And Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time, said how dreadful it is, how fantastic it is that we're about to go to war for a faraway people of which we know very little. So this story, I think the story of the city isn't well known, and it's completely amazing. So much was going on in this city in the heart of Europe. So yes, I hope that people will find out all kinds of things and encounter all kinds of stories here that they would have never heard of before.
Oh, they will. Just to take you back, though, to that first visit of yours back in the very early days of 1990. So you and your girlfriend, you rocked up as tourists. Was there much of it? There wouldn't have been much of a sort of a tourist culture at the time.
No, there was. I got a recommendation to stay at a hotel on Wenceslas Square called the Grand Hotel Europa, and I tried to make a booking there, but the person on the line just spoke no English and I spoke no Czech, so we just rocked up there at the hotel reception, and the place was infernal. There were people coming in and out. It was this Art Nouveau palace right on Wenceslas Square, and I now know I didn't know then, but I now know that all the hotel staff at the front desk, everyone, were all members of the Czech secret police, the STB. That was just like by the by. And they were the rudest, rudest people I've ever met in my life. And staying at this magnificent, threadbare, beautiful hotel with this kind of liquid curves on its staircase, this fabulous design, walnut paneling, shabby threadbare carpet and peeling wallpaper was such a treat. In the morning, I'd go downstairs and my girlfriend and I were sort of taking turns to try and engage in polite conversation with the hotel staff because it was so entertaining. They were so entertainingly rude. I would say things like, I'd say, "Hello, good morning. Can you advise me of whether I can make an international phone call from the hotel?" And she said, "No, such a thing is completely impossible here." And I said, "Oh, can you recommend a place anywhere in the city where I could make an international phone call?" And the woman said, "You think I spend all my time finding out such things for people like you?" So that was it. But everyone else in the city were wonderful. And as Australians, we were really rare birds. They'd never met Australians before. One night in Wenceslas Square, we were standing at the memorial to one of the great tragic martyrs of the Prague Spring, a young man named Jan Palach, who'd burnt himself alive, who'd sat in Wenceslas Square in 1969. We were standing there and two soldiers approached us. And they said to me, they were young, 19 or something. They had Soviet-style greatcoats on. They were Czech soldiers. And one of them said to me, "Pivo, pivo, pivo," which is beer. I did know that. I did. And so I said, yes, Arno, yes, beer. Come and drink beer with us. I thought it'd be fun to drink with a couple of soldiers. And the guy said to me, "America." And I said, no, Australia. And he said, Australia. He went, "Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane." I said, "That's very good." And he said, "Australia." And he went, "AC/DC, Angus." And he started playing air guitar in the middle of Wenceslas Square. He started going like that, hopping around like Angus Young from AC/DC. And there was another guy standing next to him, this slightly dodgy looking guy who was just really creepy. He sort of had a comb over and a briefcase and a trench coat. And he said, Kali Minogue, lucky. So it was like that. So we were rare birds, and there was none of them had met. No one I met had met an Australian before, and so that opened doors for us in a way. It meant I could have, if I wanted to find out what was going on at an anti-secret police rally, and if someone didn't speak English, they could then quickly pass me on to someone who could. So that was great. So no tourists, cheap beer, run down, everything under scaffolding, but thrilling and so beautiful, even in its threadbare beauty, Kirsty.
And so you weren't a journalist then, but did you find yourself drawn to people's stories? Were you seeking out the students who had led that revolution and talking to them?
Yes, very much. And that's why I dedicated the book to them. I think the students who led the revolution were remarkable people. They'd grown up in a completely morally contaminated environment, physically and morally. I mean, environmentally, it was a blighted landscape, pollution-wise, but morally as well, insofar as they'd grown up seeing their parents say one thing in public to the party and another thing in private to them. One of my friends, his mother hated the party, but she had to say nice things about the Communist Party just so her son could go to university. The family was under suspicion because my friend's father left after the Soviet invasion of 1968. And so that meant that they were politically suspicious. So she had to kowtow to the party in order for her son to go to university. It's bad for kids to grow up and see their parents teach them to be hypocrites and liars like that. But of course, the parents are doing it for their kids and they felt they had no choice. The point was to make you morally complicit. One night when I was in Prague at that time, I joined an anti-secret police demonstration. It seemed to spontaneously erupt. And it really surprised me because the Velvet Revolution had already happened. The communists were overthrown. So I was asking people as I was tagging around like a journalist, what's going on? Why are you protesting against the secret police? Isn't that finished? And this guy I was with who was speaking, he said, no, it's not finished. They're still around. They're still spying on people. And so this march went in front of the secret police headquarters in Bartolomewska Street. And there was a bit of a frisson at the time because earlier in Romania, the secret police there had produced guns and fired into the crowd. And there was a tension there that might happen. And Kirsty, at that point, I moved to the edge of the crowd at that point, because much as I loved Czech democracy, I don't think I was quite ready to die for it at that moment. But after it all came to an end, I got talking to a woman who was a wife. She told me she was the wife of the former Canadian ambassador, and she was telling me what it was like to live under that kind of pressure, about how everyone was being conscripted into spying on each other. This was how it induced a kind of disorientation and demoralization.
And distrust.
You couldn't really trust. That was and the point was to break down trust. And after the Velvet Revolution, when the secret police files were exposed, people discovered that husbands had been spying on their own wives, sisters against brothers, best friends were finding that their dearest friend, who was often a part of the dissident movement, had been delivering reports for the secret police. The current prime minister of the Czech Republic, Andrej Babiš, was reportedly an informant of the secret police himself. And this does terrible things to a society. It really does. It demoralizes you. It breaks down trust. It's hard to have solidarity with other people. And this was the moral contamination that the new president, Vaclav Havel, spoke of so powerfully when he became president.
And how did he go about dismantling that and rebuilding trust within the community?
I was there not long after he'd given his first speech as president. Every year, traditionally, presidents, like the Queen's New Year's Christmas speech or New Year's Day speech, the president of the Republic gives a New Year's Day speech, and Havel had just given his one. And it was the most extraordinary speech. He said, "My fellow citizens, every year my predecessors have come before you to tell you how well things are going, how our economy is flourishing, how our society is doing well, that people are becoming happier every year, that the environment is green and the sky is blue." And he said, "I presume you did not make me your president so that I would lie to you." And he said, "Things are not well. Things are not good here. The environment is ruined. Our factories are making things that people don't want or need. And worse, he's talked about this moral contamination. He said, we've become too used to thinking one thing and saying another." Now, Havel was always at points to point out that this thing that doesn't just happen under a totalitarian system like European communism. It can happen in all kinds of environments. I mean, I know people who've worked in corporations or large organizations where there's bad leadership. And people become used to saying one thing and thinking another. How morally and spiritually corruptive that kind of an environment can be. Nothing quite like a totalitarian system where, of course, you can be sent to jail for saying the wrong thing for years at a time. But nonetheless, it's still very human, all of this, and it wasn't unique to that system. So Havel believed in living in truth. That was his big phrase. And he had a great history to draw on, because throughout the centuries, the Czechs have thrown up these remarkable figures, like the great religious reformer Jan Hus in the 14th century was outspoken against corruption in the Catholic Church. And his slogan was "Truth prevails." And that was made the national motto, "Truth prevails." And sometimes it's in the past, I realize it's like a prayer of hope rather than a categorical statement. So this is it. This is the commitment he made for people to live in truth. And then you get to the hard issue of what do you do? What do you do with people who are members of the secret police? Well, criminals clearly have to be prosecuted, and there were torturers. Many of them got off. Some were prosecuted, some were not. There are those who were secret police officers. Then there were those who were merely informants. But what are you going to do? Prosecute everyone? This was the real problem that they had. To avoid hiring former communists or people who have behaved in a criminal way, but with legal cover in the past. None of this was easy. It was fraught, a terribly fraught situation.
There are many incredible figures and leaders in the history of Prague, but I'd say Václav Havel would be one of them, and I know that you're a huge fan and could talk about him probably for the whole hour. Do you think, tell us a bit more about him and how he came to be president? Because it is he was an unexpected leader in many ways.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he was actually born into a wealthy bourgeois family. If people have been to Prague, there's a beautiful arcade off Wenceslas Square called the Lucerna Arcade, and his grandfather built that. His father had a role in that as well. Havel's uncle, Miloš, built the Barandov movie studios, which turned out some of Europe's most beautiful films in the 1930s. And so he was born in quite a well-to-do family. And for that, he was ridiculed. He was quite the little prince in his family, and a little chubby boy. So he was called a fat piglet when he went to school. And he never forgot that feeling of being an outsider. He said, "My view on the world is a view from outside and below." And he said, "I've never been able to shake that." He'd never been able to shake the feeling of being an outsider and an imposter. And several times when he was president, he said, I would not be in the least surprised if at the end of my speech, 2 men from the secret police came and arrested me and put me back in a prison cell again. I would not be surprised if that happened. His life was, to use that horribly overused word, quite Kafkaesque. So that meant after the communist takeover in 1948, after the Second World War, because he came from a wealthy, well-to-do family, they had this kind of reverse discrimination. So it was impossible for him to go into university. So he joined the army instead and started writing plays. And this was in the cultural ferment of the 60s, was just kicking in. And the cultural upheaval of the 60s came to Prague like a great wave. Suddenly there was rock and roll. There was a wave of amazing filmmakers that were called the Czech New Wave, like Jerzy Menzel, and who just died recently, and Miloš Forman, who went to America and made One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and Amadeus. He was Czech. He was part of the Czech New Wave. And these amazing avant-garde films are being made, incredibly funny and beautiful films. And then there are this whole incredible slew of incredible Czech writers, like Milan Kundera, Ivan Klima, Josef Skvoretzky, and Havel. Havel's plays, which were absurdist in nature and were kind of clever and funny parodies of bureaucracies and bureaucratic cruelty and idiocy, became famous all over the world. In 1967, I think it was, he went to New York for the premiere of his play in Manhattan. He was never into the whole idea of the Prague Spring. He didn't think communism, you could reform it. You could have what the leader at the time called socialism with a human face. He thought the whole system had to be overthrown. But after the Soviet invasion, he became much more politically active and went to prison many times. He formed with his friends a group called Charter 77, which came out of defending a persecuted rock and roll band called the Plastic People of the Universe. And Charter 77 made an international impact. But ultimately, it was the students who really got the ball rolling in 1989 to begin the Velvet Revolution. But he was a man of unimpeachable moral integrity. He spent years in jail. It ruined his health, along with the smoking. But it meant that he was the perfect man for the job to lead the new Czechoslovakia into democracy, the perfect new inhabitant of Prague Castle. And he had this wicked sense of humor too. I saw him in this period, in the Velvet Revolution period. I was up at the castle and standing in front of the cathedral there, and he swept past. He was wearing, despite the cold, he was wearing shirt sleeves with I think it was a jumper tied around his neck, as I recall. And there was an entourage of people behind him and an attractive woman who was a journalist next to him that he was flirting with. And, it has to be said, he was a shocking pants man, Vaclav Havel. That was his, that was one side of his personality. And he was kind of appalled by Prague Castle. It had been occupied by these ghoulish communist leaders for decades. And he found he had to get a scooter to get from place to place because the place was so big. One day he found a door for which no one had a key, and they forced it open, and inside they found a closet and a table with a telephone on it. And he picked up the receiver of the telephone and realized it was a hotline to the Kremlin. And,
oh, goodness.
And he said, this is when Mikhail Gorbachev was the Soviet leader. He said, "This is the president of Czechoslovakia. I would like to speak to Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, please." And the woman at the other one went, "One moment, please." And the line went dead and it never became active again. Another day, going through Prague Castle, he opened a door and found a room full of people with headsets surveilling every phone call coming in and out of the castle. It was like, what are you doing here? So he brought his humor and his decency and his compassion and courage to the job. He was an incredibly impressive man.
I'm just trying to imagine someone in the early 1990s moving into Prague Castle and what that must have felt like to be living within the walls of so much history
I think
and
he
bloody
hated it.
history.
He hated it, I think. He really hated Prague Castle. He was forever looking to go to the summer home, finding more human spaces within the castle, but he became resigned to it. He kept trying to redesign it. He changed office again and again. He found it kind of gloomy and depressive after a while. And it just wasn't him to stay in such a vast network of palaces. He was never terribly happy in the castle and complained about it all the time.
In your acknowledgements at the end of your book, you talk about that period between the Prague Spring and the Velvet Revolution as being your favourite period to write about, your favourite chapter. Why is that?
Part of the most important person for me in writing that chapter, which is often called the normalization period, where this kind of weary form of communism set in after the Soviet invasion of '68. I got in contact with a guy called Paul Wilson, who lives in Canada. He's a Canadian. He went to Prague in 1967 and taught English there and learned how to speak Czech. And after the Soviet invasion, he got plugged into the rock and roll underground, and he joined a band that I mentioned earlier called the Plastic People of the Universe. Now, these were a bunch of rock and roll musicians. Most of them were working class boys, and their leader was an Andy Warhol type figure called Ivan Yirus. And Yirus had somehow gotten hold of the first Velvet Underground album, the Andy Warhol Banana thing. I mean, like, I don't think many people in Australia would have had a copy of that. Not many people outside of New York had. I think David Bowie might have had one of the 5 copies in the UK. And yet somehow a copy of this incendiary album made its way to Prague, communist Prague in the late 1960s. And these guys were completely inspired by it. And they were doing covers they were a cover band. They were doing covers of Velvet Underground songs and by the Fugs without really knowing what the lyrics meant. So they got Paul to join the band as a singer because he knew what the lyrics meant. And they had this big pyrotechnic display. They had a kind of degree of madness and Dionysian madness about them on stage that was really thrilling. They weren't a political band. They weren't singing protest songs. Their style was psychedelic and weird. And yet the regime cracked down on them so hard because the regime assumed that they were some kind of weird conspiracy. They didn't trust what they couldn't control. I mean, if they'd been smart, they just would have left them alone. That's all they wanted to be. They just wanted to be left alone, but they couldn't help themselves. They were brought in for arrests. Their fans who would meet in the countryside for impromptu rock concerts would be beaten up in baton charges by police. They completely weirdly overreacted. But this created this whole romantic thing, a scene in Prague, a subculture that Ivan Yirus called the second culture. This people, and they found a natural friend in Vaclav Havel because they were trying to do the same thing. They were trying to create art, create music, create plays, as though censorship didn't exist, which took enormous courage at the time. Ivan Yirus himself was imprisoned for years at a time and was never quite the same afterwards. But there was something so romantic about that. I really loved writing about that period. And it was also just so weird, Kirsty. There's a great joke I've got in my book, which I relate, which talks about the weird surveillance state that was there in place at the time. There was like 3 apparatchiks of the party. They come to Prague for a party meeting. They get drunk in their hotel room one night, and one of them starts to badmouth the secret police in the hotel room. And his friend says, "Shh." He says, "Be quiet. They might be bugs. They might be listening to us here." And they all laugh. His 2 mates laugh at him for that. And so he decides to play a joke on them. He goes downstairs and he talks to the woman at the front desk and says, "Could you arrange for 3 cups of tea to be delivered to the room in 15 minutes precisely?" She goes, "Okay." So he goes back up to the room and he makes a big joke of leaning into a vase of plastic flowers and says, "Hello, Comrade Major from the SDB. We would like to have 3 cups of tea delivered to our room, please." And his friends laugh. But 15 minutes later, when the tea arrives, they all blanch and get frightened and they go to bed. And he goes, "Well done, I've played my prank." The next morning, he gets up, he goes for a walk, he comes back to the hotel and his friends are gone. And he asks the receptionist, "Well, where are my friends?" And she said, "Oh, they've both been arrested. The Comrade Major said he would have arrested you too, but he really liked your joke about the tea."
Oh, my goodness.
That was the kind of jokes that were being told about the time. There was a writer called Ludwig Watzlawick Every room in his apartment was bugged. Every single room. So anytime he and his wife wanted to communicate anything of importance, they wrote it down on bits of toilet paper and then flushed it down the toilet. And they lived that way for 20 years. So
That's
writing about the
extraordinary.
it's extraordinary, I know. Just writing about the sheer strangeness of life in that time was really appealing to me.
It's very absurd. And, you know, it makes me think of another one of your favorite eras that you wrote about, the Renaissance period and the reign of Emperor Rudolph. Tell us about him.
Yeah, this was one of my favorite periods to write about as well. For a long while, Bohemia, which is the province that Prague is the capital of. Bohemia Prague is the city of the Bohemians. That was part of the broader Holy Roman Empire, which was run by the Habsburg family from Vienna. At times they ran it from Prague, and most of the time from Vienna. But in the late 1500s, the new Holy Roman Emperor was Rudolph II of the Habsburg family. And he looked like a very typical Habsburg Rudolph. Years of interbreeding had meant that because Habsburgs only trusted themselves to marry other Habsburgs, so first cousins and double first cousins were getting married all the time, I'm afraid, Kirsty, and it meant that they weren't pretty. They were not pretty after decades and decades of interbreeding. Rudolph had the big, long, distended jaw, the pendulous lower lip, the big nose, the eyes, all of that. But Rudolph was a real one-off. He was, I think, he suffered from depression, all kinds of mental illness and paranoia. He was deeply sensitive, intellectually utterly voracious and inquisitive, and he hated Vienna. And so he moved the court of the Holy Roman Emperor to Prague, where he rebuilt the palace there. And many of those beautiful palaces we see today were built by Rudolph II in the late 16th century, early 17th century. And Rudolph was never really interested in running an empire. What Emperor Rudolph really wanted to do was discover the secrets of the universe. Like a lot of Renaissance intellectuals at the time, Rudolph thought the universe was one great, big, enormous, beautiful puzzle created by God, the same God who had given us all the power of wisdom and reason to be able to fathom what he'd done. So it was like a puzzle we had to work out, like a big, gigantic crossword puzzle we had to figure out. And to that end, he became very interested in magic, in alchemy, and science, which were all sort of, the boundaries between all those things were very, very blurry at the time. Like astrology overlapped into astronomy. Alchemy and chemistry were pretty much the same thing at the time. And so he invited some of the greatest scientists of the era to live in Prague. He invited Tycho Brahe and then Johannes Kepler, who came to Prague, who were both these imperial mathematicians. And it was in Prague that Kepler decoded the secret of planetary motion, the nature of planetary motion, which had befuddled everyone, since the time of Aristotle, pretty much. He also invited great alchemists who were members of his court to practice, go about the search for this mysterious thing that was the Philosopher's Stone. Once you had the Philosopher's Stone, you had this primordial kind of matter that would do two things for you that were very attractive to Rudolph. The Philosopher's Stone would allow you to make this matter into gold, to turn lead and mercury gold. He was always in need of gold. And it would also provide you with an elixir of eternal youth. And he was obsessed with those things. So all sorts of alchemists came to Prague. A great many of them were charlatans in order to try and get the emperor's favor to create the Philosopher's Stone. He also had this incredible part of the palace he called a Kunstkammer, which was like a chamber of wonders, wherein he kept all these remarkable things, like a unicorn's horn that probably actually came from a narwhal, but he thought it was a unicorn's horn. He had a chalice there he believed was the Holy Grail, the cup that caught Christ's blood as it dripped off him while he was on the cross. He had a robotic peacock. He had a bit of quartz where just by chance, the veining in the quartz spelled Christ. So that seemed magical to him. And he also had this menagerie of extraordinary beasts. He had several lions, tigers at Prague Castle. He had cheetahs at his hunting lodge outside the city. He had a cassowary that was brought over from New Guinea. This is in the 1500s. He had a dodo from Mauritius, obviously before they became extinct. And he had the hide of a rhinoceros on the wall. His favorite animal was a lion called Muhammad, which was a gift to him from the Turkish Sultan. and Muhammad was allowed free range around Prague Castle. The thing about Rudolph, though, was he was always short of money, and he could never afford to feed Muhammad properly. So Muhammad was often hungry as he padded around Prague Castle and tore out bits, occasionally mauled Rudolph's servants. And we know this is true because there are receipts like, oh, we had to pay 800 ducats to the family of poor Johann who got mauled by Muhammad the other day. So he was this incredibly eccentric person who was trying to find the secret correspondences between all things in the universe. Dr. John Dee, who was Queen Elizabeth I's magician, the model for Prospero in The Tempest. He came to Prague along with his charlatan and sidekick Edward Kelly as well, and the two of them believed they were communing with angels while they were in Prague. This is a theme I've had going through the book, that Prague is this liminal city. It's this place where strange things come into the world, strange ideas come into the world. It's where you get the story of the legendary Golem of Prague. That's attributed to this time.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is actually kind of retrofitted to Prague after the fact, but the legend is attached to the great rabbi of Prague at the time, a man, Rabbi Lev, his name was, one of the great rabbinical scholars of all time, who lived in Prague in the Jewish quarter, which later became known as Josephov. And it was said that Rabbi Lowe, in order to protect the Jews from the pogroms of the Christians, the attacks from the Christians, he went down with his three assistants to the banks of the Vltava River, which was just on the edge of the Jewish quarter. And they scooped up mud and they made a monster, a huge, gigantic giant of a creature known as a golem. And he brought it to life by inscribing the word for life into the mud creature's head, and it came to life. And it became the protector of the Jewish quarter. And it would stop Christians from framing the Jews, which they were worried would happen all the time. There was the Jewish libel at the time that said the Jews wanted to harvest the blood of Christian children for the Passover, which of course was a monstrous, lie and a slander. But sometimes Christians would creep into the Jewish quarter and with a dead child that had been killed by their hands, and so the Jews could be blamed for it. So the golem, the legend goes, was there to protect the Jews from dead children that might be put in people's houses. But the thing was, the golem was to be deactivated on the Sabbath. And one day the rabbi did that. So the golem went on a rampage, smashing houses, tearing up trees, until he got the golem to bend down, scrubbed out the first letter, which changed the word on his head to death, and then he just collapsed into a pile of river mud. And afterwards, it was said that these slops of mud were put into a chest and taken up into the attic of the great synagogue in Prague. And the rumor was that it was sitting up there to this day, that ready to be reactivated in case the Jews reached a moment of mortal peril.
Until someone went looking for it about 100 years ago and found nothing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a journalist called Egon Kisch. The same guy came to Australia in the 1930s. That's a whole other story I didn't tell because there wasn't time for it. But Egon Kisch was a communist Jewish journalist who thought he'd get up first thing in the morning one morning, this is the 1920s, I think, and he brought a ladder when no one was around, crept up, moved a tile off the roof of the synagogue, crept in to see if there was a chest of mud up there. A bat crashed into his head, which frightened the hell out of him, as you might imagine. And he crept about and nearly hurt himself, but he found no chest of mud. And he was quite pleased by that, he said, because he was a communist and he was an atheist and didn't have any time for such myths. But of course, then as Hitler came into the country and invaded the city, he really did come to wish there was such a thing as a golem to protect the Jews from the awful catastrophe that fell upon them from 1939 onwards. The Jewish presence of Prague is the saddest thing in the book, I think, in many ways. That it was almost completely extinguished by Hitler and his Nazi lieutenants. It's terribly sad, and you feel the absence today when you're in Prague. There's a kind of a sense of awful grief and absence every time I go into the Jewish quarter.
I think you say in the book that prior to World War II, there was 17,000 Jews and 420 odd left by the end of the war.
They survived by hiding with Gentile friends, most of them, and getting into the countryside, hiding in farms. And those who survived came back to Prague and walked around the Jewish quarter, walked around the synagogues, and just saw no Jewish life. And most of their friends were dead. a great many migrated to places like the United States, Canada in particular, and some to Australia as well. Yes, so it's a terrible catastrophe. Prague was this place, this city, where there were three great peoples. There was the Czechs, of course, the German Bohemians, and the Jewish people. The Jewish people were murdered in the Second World War. After the Second World War, the Czechs had had enough of their German neighbours, and so most of them were expelled from the country, and then they divorced with Slovakia in 1993, and so the Czechs have got the country all to themselves now. But I kind of wonder if that must be an odd and lonely feeling for some, I think.
Yeah, I know that the Roma people are, highly vindicated in the Czech Republic.
Yes,
such a homogenous country.
Yeah, there are Roma people there now. I don't know if you'd use the word indigenous, but the Czech, the original Czech Roma people were almost every single one of them was murdered in the Holocaust. So the Roma people there today are Slovak Roma people who've migrated into the country since the war. The Bohemian Roma were all killed in the Holocaust. It's a dreadful story.
So the Jewish quarter still exists, though, as a community, as a part of a neighbourhood of Prague. How does it feel to walk around it now?
Weird. The thing about the Jewish quarter, Josephov as it's called, is that most of it was torn down in the 19th century for urban renewal. It was named Josephov after the Emperor Joseph II, who you see in the movie Amadeus, the Habsburg Emperor he made it possible for the Jewish people of Prague to come out of the ghetto, to have an education. They were encouraged to start businesses. And pretty quickly, Great Praguers became very wealthy and successful, moved out of the slums of the Jewish quarter and bought very nice houses, thank you very much, in some of the nicest parts of the city. And so after a while, there weren't that many Jewish people living in Josephov, and it sort of became a down and out slum. And it lost its Jewish character, but it still maintained its great synagogues and its fabulous, amazing Jewish cemetery right in the middle of the quarter. So the city's fathers in the late 19th century decided to tear most of the slums down and rebuild the area in like Paris, like building these Beaux-Arts Parisian apartment blocks, like Baron Haussmann had been doing in Paris. And they're still there today. And as a result, Josephov, the Jewish quarter, only feels Jewish in parts around the synagogue and the cemetery. The rest of it is weirdly like Paris. And the main drag that goes through it, Pariska Street or Paris Street, is like where all the high-end, super high-end shops are. Like that's where you get your Gucci and your Prada and your Armanis and all that along that strip of fashionable shops there. So it's the kind of rich part of the center of Prague now. So that doesn't feel very authentically Jewish at all, but you can still get that vibe though when you walk around in the very center of the Jewish quarter. There's still the Jewish town hall there that was built during the Renaissance. And that's an amazing building. That's a kind of Baroque neoclassical building. And it's got two clocks on it. Right at the top steeple, there's a conventional clock with conventional numerals that go around. And then there's a Jewish clock. And I don't know if a clock like this exists anywhere else in the world, which runs backwards. It's got Jewish numerals on it, written in Hebrew, I should say, Hebrew numerals on it. And Hebrew is written right to left, not left to right, like Latin script is. And so consequently, perhaps because of that, the clock runs backwards. So there's a clock on top that runs clockwise, a clock below it that runs counterclockwise, which is so delightful. It makes me happy every time I look at it. So there is that. There is that.
What was the most surprising thing that you learned about Prague?
Oh, that's the most surprising thing I learned about Prague. Well, for one, its location. I know that's an odd thing to say.
Yes.
But we think of Prague as being Eastern European. And you really just don't want to say that when you're in Prague. You get all this eye rolling. People go, we're not Eastern European. We are Central European. You look at your map, we are right in the dead heart of Europe, right in the very center of Europe. It's quicker to fly to London from Prague than Moscow. That's one interesting fact, much quicker, in fact. Mm-hmm. And Prague is actually further west than Vienna. So they're not interested in hearing about them being Eastern European. That's one little kind of mistaken idea that we have. I think that comes from them being a Soviet satellite state after the Second World War. That was called Eastern Europe because it was on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So that was very much part of the Velvet Revolution, was to reestablish the place as at the heart of Europe. Back to Europe was the big slogan at the time. The other thing is that, oh my God, the Czechs are so funny. Like that's a real cliche, but they have this whole rich culture of Europe. They're like the Irish of Central Europe. It's an enormously funny place. They have a wonderful culture of humorous civil disobedience. A fine example of this was that Paul Wilson, when he went to Prague, his friends from the Plastic People of the Universe, they formed a group called the Crusader School of Humor Without Jokes. And they set themselves up as a kind of a quasi-secret society, but it was all just a piss take of the whole thing. And you knew that the old spirit of rebellion was reviving in 1988, just before the Velvet Revolution, when a group emerged called the Society for a Merrier Present. And this group, the Society for a Merrier Present, organized a march across the Charles Bridge where these young men appeared militaristically, but with helmets made out of watermelon shells. And they were carrying salami stick truncheons and like secret, like riot police, but with watermelons and salami. And they were holding up a banner, like a political banner made up of a sheet, but nothing was written on it. It was completely blank. And so, of course, when the police arrived, they confiscated the sheets, which had, all the bystanders, like, you can't believe what they're seeing. They're falling about laughing. And during the Soviet invasion, they did all sorts of pranks as well, like to put the Soviet army off the scent. They took street signs and they rotated them 45 degrees so that no street sign was correct and everyone got lost all the time. And at the time in '68, that people were walking around with transistor radios to their ears so they could get the BBC and Radio Free Europe. And the Soviet army and the police went around and confiscated these transistors. So Praguers then went walking around with bricks of coal held up to their ears and were delighted when the police confiscated the coal as well. So they're forever doing stunts like this. They always had jokes. They always made brilliant jokes about the situation they were in. And this all comes out of the tradition of Jaroslav Hašek, who wrote The Good Soldier Švejk, which some people might be familiar with, which has this brilliant form of civil disobedience where you obey every order given to you by the fascists to 110%. And in doing so, you completely undermine what the order was about in the first place. And you salute and go, yes, sir. So, they've got a genius for humorous undermining, for play, for turning things around on their meaning in such glorious and daffy ways.
One of the most surprising things for me from the book, and this just may be my complete ignorance of history, was that US troops were poised, ready to liberate Prague well before Soviet troops arrived, and were given orders not to. And I couldn't help but wonder if they had been given permission to do so, whether the course of modern history may have been completely altered for the country.
So, sorry, I might ask you to ask that again because my internet connection just went a bit wonky there for a second. Could you just, sorry, Kirsty, could you ask me that again? Sorry,
the issues of doing this all online. One of the most surprising things for me about the book, one of the things I learned, and it may just be my ignorance of history, was that US troops were poised, ready to liberate Prague before Soviet troops arrived and were told not to. And it just struck me so deeply that if they had been given permission to do so, might that have completely altered the course of the history of the country?
I thought about that a lot. Would the arrival of General Patton of the US Army in 1945, if the Americans led by General Patton had liberated Prague instead of the Red Army, if they'd not been forced to wait outside of Prague in Pilsen and allow the Soviet army to liberate Prague, which was under orders from General Eisenhower at the time, if the Americans had liberated Prague, given that some thought, I think it would have actually. I think the country would have had the option then to become like Austria did, which was to be non-aligned, to be independent and neutral, which would have allowed it to be democratic. It would have allowed the country to be have a market economy like Austria, but not aligned one way or other with the Soviet bloc or the US and its allies. So I think that was a possibility that was lost there. But having said that, communism was actually somewhat popular in that nation after the Second World War. They never won a plurality, well, they never won a majority of votes. At one point, they were the most popular party in the country, though, if not the overwhelming 50% plus. So it's hard to know. It can go either way. I think this is one of the things I think I learned from reading about the history of this book, is that they told themselves a different story at the end of the Second World War than we told ourselves in the Western democracies. At the end of the Second World War, the story we tell ourselves about that is that a great evil arose in the land, which was Hitler. The democracies were slow to rouse themselves, but eventually they did. And overwhelming force was brought to bear against Hitler, who perished ignominiously outside his bunker in 1945. And there's this kind of a story, the way we tell that story, we kind of imagine that the universe lent moral energy to what we were doing, that good defeated evil. And, you know, quite frankly, I think that's true. I think a great wickedness was defeated when Hitler was defeated by the resolution of the Western democracies. But in places like the Czechoslovakia, in Poland, they drew different conclusions, particularly in Czechoslovakia. In Prague, they'd been the capital of a really good, proper democracy. They had respect for human rights. Gender equality was legislated for. All these things were in place, and it meant nothing, you know, when that happened, when Hitler came along and smashed it. Their fellow democracies were shown to be weak and irresolute. So at the end of the war, a lot of Czechs thought, Praguers thought, well, might makes right, I suppose. That's the lesson we've learned. Our good, decent little democracy we had meant nothing in the end, faced by this terrible the violence of Hitler. And so a great many of them concluded that, well, the whole system was rotten, start again, clean slate, build it up from the ground by building some kind of a workers' state, which was communism to them, which seemed more realistic to a lot of them at the time. So there was an admiration for communism, which seems really tragic to me now. I mean, the nature of the Stalinist regime in Russia and the Soviet Union was quite apparent at that point. That there were a great many gulled Western intellectuals, and in Prague as well, who were gulled by the promise of communism and or the idea of, oh, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. But as historian Norman Davies said, was the eggs were millions and millions of lives, and the omelette turned out to be inedible. It was unfathomably cruel and wicked what was going on in the Soviet Union at the time. Mass starvation, famine brought in for political control, the mass arrests, state terror, a police state. This was all apparent. But there were far too many, I'm afraid to say, Western intellectuals willing to shrug at it. It's such a damn shame. And really a lot of those intellectuals that rebelled against the system in the 1960s in Prague, those writers I mentioned, more than a few of them had been Stalinist lieutenants in the 1950s. Now, it's not well remembered, but Milan Kundera, who wrote these kind of brilliant exposés of the Stalinist system, he was writing like odes to Stalin in the 1950s. He was a very loyal, yes, sir, lieutenant of the Communist Party in the 1950s. And I think they saw it all get away from them, as Kundera wrote, and wondered what the hell they were going to do now, and they tried to reform it. So I think there is. I'm sorry, I've gone quite a long way from the question you asked me, Kirsty, but I suppose there was a possibility there. If the Americans had taken Prague in 1945, they could have been spared all the Stalinist terror or the shocking things that followed after the communist takeover. It's a possibility. It was foolish of Eisenhower not to allow it. Churchill wanted it. Patton certainly did. General Patton certainly did. And this is the same General Patton from that movie from the late 1960s, but it didn't happen. And to this day, there's still resentment in Prague about that it was left to the Red Army to liberate Prague from the Nazis and not the US and its allies.
So when you returned to Prague last year to research this book, how how different was it to the Prague that you had arrived in 1990?
It was exactly the same and completely different. I took a photo of myself in January 1990, and this is a much younger version of myself, and I've got it in the book, of me standing at Prague Castle, looking out at the city, looking down at Malá. And I took a similar photo last year of me, fortunately looking just as lovely and as youthful as I did
Just as
30 years
handsome.
ago. As you can see, nothing's changed at all here, Kirsty. It's quite miraculous.
You look exactly
really.
the same.
Yeah. I pay people to tell me that, and you can see the houses are they're still the same houses, but they've all been repaired. The roofs are straight. They've been painted. The grime is gone. The scaffolding is gone. It's all looking spick and span. They're still, but it's the same architecture, the same houses, the same beauty is still there. There's some fantastic kind of new modern buildings, which I actually quite like. There's brilliant public sculpture there, really brilliant public sculpture from a guy called David Cherney. There are vast hordes of tourists, even in the middle of winter, not during this COVID period, of course, but even in the middle of winter. The clutter, I suppose that's fair to say, the Charles Bridge, the little shops that under communism sold nothing much in particular, that sold, like tiny little booklets and bookmarks, or 100 different kinds of mineral water for what different complaints of the body. They've been replaced by tourist shops that sell little green bottles of absinthe, fridge magnets, matryoshka dolls, which aren't, of course, Czech, they're Russian. They sell Franz Kafka tea towels, but not Franz Kafka's books. So but my attitude to that, Kirsty, was, look, just suck it up, Fidler. What do you want? Communism to come back? What do you want? What do you want? And in any case, I'm one of those people, aren't I? I'm one of those people from elsewhere, travelers who are cluttering up the Charles Bridge. So what right do I have to complain? So with all those people, though, some of the mystique of Prague is lost, but you can get it late at night in winter and very early in the morning. If you walk through the streets just before midnight or well after midnight, it's still there. It is again, that prickling sense of apprehension, that's ineffable quality, that strangeness that so beguiled me when I first went there.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, for taking the time to talk to us today. I wouldn't quite go so far as to call it a love letter to Prague, but it's pretty close, and it really is just such a wonderful read. I learned so much, so thank you so much for that.
Oh, thank you for your wonderful questions, Kirsty.
And I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Kumbali 20 was made possible with the support of the Yayasan Mudra Swari Saraswati patron program and their donors. The patron program was created to seek assistance for the survival of both festivals, the Food Festival and the Writers and Readers Festival, and the foundation. And so by making a contribution to the Yayasan patron program, you can be directly involved in delivering both those festivals. Your contribution will also help to guarantee the future of Indonesia's most meaningful cross-cultural platform of words, ideas, culture, and the creative arts. And I can't wait to be back there in person next year. In the meanwhile, you can follow at Ubud Writers Festival on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, or visit ubudwritersfestival.com for more information about the patron program. Thank you so much. Goodbye.